O Lord, woe is me, Pharisee. Guard the door to my mouth, the gates to our ears. May we always deny ourselves, take up the cross, and follow you. Remind us who we are in you, lived, crucified, and resurrected. Amen. So, this originally was a sermon preached on Thursday in front of the gathering of the Uniting Church, both the church side and the services side, that is, the people who do social services and that agency of the church. So I'm for those who came in late, I'm replacing someone who's sick. So I'll be making edits as we go through to the context we're in this evening. This is a sermon in 3 parts. Part 1, what the heck is going on in this verse? Part 2, what the heck has that got to do with me? And part 3, oh heck, it's got a lot to do about me. Am I a hypocrite? Let's begin. The dead Lion King Mufasa emerges out of the clouds on a wind-swept savannah night, and he booms to his son Simba, "Remember who you are." Church, remember who you are. And when I say church, folks, I mean those who are on the council, those who work for the church, those of you who have come every week for 10 years, those of you who've been coming for longer, those of you who've walked in for the first time this evening. We are all members of the one church. Religion means religio. It comes from Latin. I'm going to say it's Latin. It means to bind together. And we must always remember to rebind ourselves together as members of the church. When we talk about membership, we talk about this understanding from the Bible, like members are like parts of the body, fingers and hands and shoulders and ears and so on. And so when we talk about remembering, we don't just mean remembering in our mind, we also mean rebinding ourselves to each other as the children of God. When I imagine us as church, I recall the great dream of Ezekiel 37, read to us by Manic. Remembering together, the dry bones rattling with the breath, as verdant orchid vines emerge from dry dust and entwine tibia to femur, clavicle to scapula, as eucalypt saplings shoot through sandy, parched ribs, curling together, pastors and preachers, doers and students, nurses and social workers, engineers, people who don't work but minister in their own ways. This church is knit together, bound together by living vines. The church, this church, all of you, is alive and it shivers with the Spirit. Deep in the bones of this uniting church, the denomination and this building, in the wood of this chapel and in the red-hot blood is the red-hot blood of loving outrage. That public anger that comes from our deep grief for the gap between God's loving world as it should be and this tired old broken state and city as it is, with its oppressions, its hidden violence, and its secret shames. This story is about remembering who you are. For without the memory to fire our hearts, our eyes lose that imaginative glint as we endure the prosaic boredoms of study and exams and work and commuting and the 440 bus or whatever it might be. We forget. If you're a new member to this story, either in your faith or into this church, listen up. If you're an old member to this story, then I pray hear it with fresh spirit and ears. Part 1. What the heck is going on here in this verse? So let's back up. Who is this Jesus character? So he starts off life as a refugee, hustled to Egypt, escaping Herod, who stole and killed a generation of babies. And then the family returned to Nowheresville, Palestine, a little place called Nazareth. It's right near this old city, Sepphoris, that before Jesus started his carpentry had rebelled against the Romans, and in response the Romans had flattened it, massacred the population, and on it built an entirely new city called Tiberias. In equivalence language today, it might be called Putinsville or Trump Town. And you can make an educated, calculated guess that the masons and the carpenters would have been schlepping up from Nazareth to Tiberias to help build it. So Jesus grew up in this puppet state. And in this verse, he's been on tour and he's heading to the big city, the big olive, the center of theopolitical power of that region, Jerusalem. And by this time, he's surrounded by the peasants and his motley disciples, some of whom are Pharisees themselves, some of whom smell like dead fish. Publicly, he confronts the Pharisees. "You sit on Moses' seat," Jesus says. "You are no Moses," Jesus infers. Who are these folks, these Pharisees? Well, first up, they ain't much like the modern Uniting Church clergy because they are much, much more powerful. They ain't just legal religious leaders. They are supported by the whole land of Palestine. All the peasants are supporting them through their tithe. They are a caste of holy men. The whole economy supports. They're Pharisees. And what do these guys do? They do what we all do when we get comfortable. They defend their position with creeping legalism, with box ticking. They lust for the letter of the law and not the spirit. They don't walk the talk. Jesus says, "Woe to you, vipers, woe!" It's a curse. It's a curse of grief, a profound condemnation. Jesus is grieving that his fellow Hebrews of the Torah are putting these burdens on these poor people like donkeys. He's weighing their tiny sacrifices of cumin and dill and mint and all other herbs, and they're extracting their tithes. Jesus is saying, where's the justice? Where's the faith? Where's the mercy, folks? You hypocrites. The root of the word anger, and those who've heard me preach before have heard me say this, is the Norse word ang. It's also the root of the word Angst in German and English. It means grief. It's the sound that you make at the funeral when you can't cry anymore. Ang! Ang! Anger comes from grieving for those that we care about, when rightful love has been denied. This passage tears out of the page and smacks us in the face. It makes us feel at once righteously angry when we're in Jesus' sandals, and then deeply ashamed when we're in the Pharisees' sandals. Oh dear, oh me. Is this what Jesus would think of me? When we stand in the sandals of the smelly peasant onlookers on the mount, we feel awe at this carpenter, prophet of the poor, whose words speak to our deep and hidden and unsaid feelings of grief and anger. Wouldn't it be amazing if the people of Leichhardt or the people of campus or the people of our workplaces, the people we minister to, look to us as the church with that sense? These onlookers know he's heading for the capital. And maybe they have a little inkling that in a few weeks' time from now, he'll be suffocating to death on the instrument of public terror, the cross, condemned by his own people, baying for his blood. Theologically, there is a lot going on here. You could probably do a whole series on Matthew 23. I'm just picking up one little piece. And what I'm raising up today is how this idea of loving outrage that confronts those in power is throughout the Christian story. This is not the doilies and scones and cordial of the church we grew up in, for those of you who grew up in the church. This is not cultural church. This is what we call the radical church. That's sitting right there in the text. It's a story, by the way, that starts in the sands of Egypt and all the way up to today. And tomorrow when you go to work or you go to uni or wherever you're going tomorrow. Or the kitchen in Epworth House. Or wherever. Part 2. What the heck has this got to do with me? Remember who you are. This is a story where Pharaoh comes last, where a basket-born orphan, a stutterer, and a shamed murderer, full of loving outrage for his people, groaning under the whip, confronts the Pharaoh who refuses to budge. Moses leads his people to a promised land. It's a story that throughout the Old Testament, prophetic, lonely, dreaming Hebrew voices of the wilderness confront with loving outrage the sins of powerful Hebrew kings and their violent empires and greedy fiefdoms, calling on them to remember who they are and act in accordance with the liberating, faithful God of justice and mercy. It's a story founded in the pillars of the churches that were there before the uniting church. For those who don't know, there were 3 churches: Presbyterian, Methodist, Congregationalist. Pretty dour, stiff upper lip kind of types. They became the uniting church in 1977. But even amongst that, when we think back, we think of old folks, we think of them kind of, conservative and buttoned up. Well, actually, these churches had a whole range of prophetic troublemakers who condemn the Pharisees of this shiny city. One of them, there's many, but one of them is one of my favourites. He's a Methodist minister. His name's Reverend Bill Hobbin. Boots stained with the shit of the slums in the inner city, he takes a megaphone and a Herald journalist over to the genteel homes of Bellevue Hill in the eastern suburbs. And outside, he names them. He names the people living inside who own the slums, and they inside are fuming, humiliated at those damned Methodists. It's a story where the folks in Uniting Care have had to confront us in the Congregational Church. For example, on the North Shore, a place called the Garrison Aged Care Facility. Uniting wanted to get poor and destitute folks in there, but the dour, worshipping church there used the letter of the law to fight them, because the kind of people they wanted in at their Garrison church, their Garrison hostel, their aged care facility in Mossman, was what we call respectable PLUs, people like us. They were confronted by Uniting, and justice won the day. The past displays plenty of division between the different parts of the church. The lesson we've learned here, that Carol and I and Jesse and I and Dorothy from the morning congregation who've been here a long time, others of you who've come for the journey, is that division is for the past. We have to remember the spirit of what it is to be uniting, to be bound together, to leave that division behind. You see, the great story of the Synod in New South Wales, that's the agency that looks, well, it's the New South Wales part of the Uniting Church, was that when they commissioned the agency, they said it will be both service and justice. Everywhere else around the country, it was just services, aged care, home care, but in this place they said it'll be justice and services. And it reflected a spirit in this state church. It tells a story of a church who sits with the sick and asks with loving anger why they are sick, who comforts the lonely and fights with loving anger for mental health funding, who feed the homeless and fight with loving anger for affordable housing, And likewise with all of the oppressions of Indigenous, queer, poor and disadvantaged. Our response, born of that fire, honed by wisdom, is to always be agitating the powers that be, sometimes adapting ourselves, sometimes reforming within, sometimes resisting. This vision of the church is needed in this place. Remember, this city is top 1% of top 1% of the world, and we have our fair share of hypocrites. In this story, a young carpenter is the living flesh of God and turns the whole Western world upside down. Talk about keeping the faith, doing justice and building community. Crucifixion at the hands of the puppet state is what Jesus got for doing that. So buckle up, Leichhardt Uniting. That's what's in store when you follow this story. In this story, as you confront power, get ready for them to keep coming for you. From tabloid pages, our modern moralistic, deal-measuring, long-fringed Pharisees pass judgment on the city's poor and disadvantaged. Radio shock jocks who love to have people call in and call them teacher, who love to have the best seat in the house. Be ready for them to tell you that your compassion is weakness, that your love is foolish, that your advocacy with God's children, whether disabled or trans or refugees or drug prone or single or struggling or out of prison, is the dangerous and subversive stuff of bleeding hearts. They, of all people, will question your commitment to Jesus. And if you're not experiencing that yet because you're just in uni, you wait till you get out into the workplace. You wait till you start putting some of your credibility on the line for those values. That's why the story of the good news is weirdly ironic. It's good news for the world. It ain't good news for us because it's bloody hard work. And it won't always make you popular. Part 3. Oh heck, I'm a hypocrite too. The story of Jesus rebuking the Pharisees is not only a remembering of the old struggle against injustice, it is also a profound spiritual challenge to all of us to resist the inner black-letter pedant and petty self-righteous egoist. How do we stop ourselves becoming like the Pharisees? Are there parts of yourself that you think is like the Pharisees? Certainly for me, I got a big ego. Every day I got to get out and put a pin in it. We as communities of doers, we live it out through servant action, fueled by our loving outrage for the afflicted. We as a community of leaders, and do not forget that you are leaders. This is the leadership of the church in this place. You may not see it yet, but people, the young and young at heart, is the future of the church, is sitting here. We remember it through the long prophetic story of the church. And we as community of faithful refound our personal commitment to Jesus and live out publicly his rule of non-violent justice in the world. Here is my challenge for you. Remember your loving anger for those we serve and he that we follow. Do not let the comfort of inner city life dampen your edge, or the comfort of a full-time job, or the comfort of walking through the quad and getting a coffee and going, oh, it's a pretty good life. As I said to these folks the other night, it's easy to forget Tari from Turramurra, or Raby from Randwick, or Brewarrina from the Sydney University Quad or Conservatorium of Music, Nazareth from the Temple. It was Peter Warland's farewell on Thursday. That was the reason that I was preaching, and I reflected that he taught us as the church a lot. to remember the importance of loving anger, of confrontation, of action, and of remembering ourselves. And I shared this story that some of you might know. 5 years ago, Peter Wallen and I were sitting at Grind Cafe, which is now closed down, opposite the dilapidated corpse of Harold Hawkins Court. For those who don't know, it's a uniting facility with 100 empty beds built by this church, right here, from this place, chook raffles and everything, raised the money to build it. And it sat empty, derelict for a decade. And in that conversation, our mutual loving outrage was palpable in our conversation. We had to remind each other of the spirit of what uniting meant, working together, not to fight over the scraps, but to imagine and to confront the hypocrites on council who, in a deep shade of green, and Jesse knows this story, he was there, spoke about affordable housing values, but who opposed the very development that was going to make it possible on NIMBY grounds. NIMBY means not in my backyard. We spoke with calculated, wise, polite, loving outrage, and came consistently and persistently to council meetings and consultations, and through people power, we won. It is called organised religion, after all. And Harold Hawkins will soon, at some point, spring back to life. Our unfinished business here is this Wetherell Street, to be a place that teems with new life, even bigger and better than what we have now. A centre of discipleship and justice, affordable housing, so that the young and spirited from across this state, from across regional New South Wales and beyond, and from people in the city, can come to this place and refound ourselves with the cross at the centre. To conclude, for those of you who are struggling with your faith and you're full of doubt, well, at least you can follow the compassionate, wise ways of the historical, human Jesus who lived. We faithful follow not just the living, not just the murdered Jesus, but the resurrected Jesus. We believe in resurrection. We are not people of whimpering endings, of hopeless despair, of long, languid declines of pew sitters, nor those who sit idly by and accept lifelong disadvantage. The Uniting Church is going to get smaller, but we don't need to get weaker. And that's up to us, actually, us and about 12 other churches in the state. We do not forget the loving outrage in our blood. Our story is of people of full-bodied resurrection, of life that springs back after the bushfire, of skeletal blackened bark blooming 100-fold in sprouts of green, and new seeds woken by fire and spread for all the coloured parrots of the sky. Remember who you are.